Well, good afternoon. My name is Matt Frost. I'm with the Wisconsin Procurement Institute, and I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about us in a second, but I'll start by introducing myself a little bit more formally. I am the government contracting specialist for Wisconsin Procurement Institute, but I was brought in specifically to help address some cybersecurity needs around the state and through both state and federal contracting. My background is I was previously with the United States Air Force Cyber Operations Team, where I worked at a variety of forward deployed locations, providing security for the three-letter agencies, as well as auditing and assessing the security platforms for state Air Force and joint service bases. Right before I moved to Wisconsin, I was actually contracting myself, both overseas and domestically, but my last station was at Camp Arifjan with OMDAC SWACA, which stands for Operations Management Defense of Army Communications for Southwest Asia and Central Asia. In other words, the Middle East and Northern Africa. WPI is what's formerly known as a Procurement Technical Assistance Center, and we are now known as an Apex Accelerator. We are managed by the Department of Defense's Office of Small Business Programs, and we're funded by state and federal agencies. We have offices throughout the entire state and counselors available at any time. And our primary mission, not to read off all of this wonderful stuff, but our primary mission is to assist small businesses, particularly diverse businesses, in preparing themselves to attempt to win and then win bids at the state and federal level for contracts. And these are some of our office locations. They're scattered throughout the state. I myself am based in the Madison office, but I am frequently on the road everywhere. All right, so as we get started today, the big question is, why should we worry about our IT infrastructure and our cybersecurity? And the answer was presented very clearly to us by Alliance. They do an annual survey of several thousand companies and say, what are your biggest concerns and what are your biggest negative impacts on your business? And for the second year in a row, cyber incidents was actually number one. Several $1 billion a year get extracted from private industry within the United States. That number continues to go up dramatically. And it's important to note that this is just the money extracted from the companies. It doesn't count the intellectual property, and it doesn't count the time, the money spent in both time, capital, and resources to try and repair some of these incidents. 3 years ago, business interruption was the number one, and that's because we had the COVID pandemic breakout. So just to give you an idea of how impactful cyber incidents have become, cyber, by the way, was number 2 that year. All right, so within the construction industry and general contracting in general, we see some trends and innovations that are happening. Normally, people look at contracting and construction and they see it as an industry that tends to lag behind some of the others like manufacturing in regards to digitalization and some of the modernization efforts we've seen across other industries, but that's changing. From last year to this year, double the amount of construction companies have gone to a more digital format, which includes using more handheld devices in the field, automatic weighing and inventory management systems, remote job management tools, cloud-based utilities, distributed sales, things like that. All of these things are helping push efficiency through contracting and construction, which is typically a huge part of maintaining margins and winning contracts. So with this increased digital footprint, with this modernization comes a new vulnerability, where you have companies that have not typically operated as a very digitally heavy landscape, now investing into the space and not having with them the skill set or experience necessarily to protect themselves to all the threats that exist in the space. So when we look at third-party IT providers, there's a few things you need to weigh. Number one size isn't going to fit all. Every different outfit is going to have different needs, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. But there tends to be some pros and cons, and the pros are on the left and the cons are on the right for those watching. Some of the pros of hiring a third-party company to do your IT are that you're hiring into a diverse skill set, meaning typically third-party providers have a team of people with a variety of skills and specialties that they can deploy to assist you. They have access to newer technology. Because technology tends to be their business, they're upgrading their tools very rapidly and trying to pace the industry. So you can get access to some of those newer tools. There are, and the asterisk here is important, there can be reduced operational costs. Hiring in-house IT might be out of your budget or not a reasonable use of your budget. You bring in one individual who manages your entire IT infrastructure, say you pay him, just throwing out a number, $65,000 a year. Potentially, you can spend less than that on a managed service provider and get a team of people to meet your needs, or spend far less than that if you don't really have many needs. So that's something to consider. And then again, I repeated myself, I can't stress it enough, the diversity of skill sets is a huge advantage. You know, typically IT specialists have areas that they are very confident in and their skill sets very honed in. And for instance, mine is security and compliance. But before that, and it took years to develop that, I was pretty much basically systems administration. And at least within the military, systems administration and network architecture are completely different. They do not overlap hardly at all. And so because of that, it's important when you're choosing IT providers, even if it's only one person, that their skill set kind of can mold into what you need. Now, some of the cons are important to mention too. For small businesses in particular, your business is your baby. It's your livelihood. It's you. And because of that, you want to have control over every aspect of that business as much as possible. When you outsource your IT, you are actually giving up, and this is very real to state. And if a third-party provider tries to tell you that you're not fully in control, it's understood that you have a partnership in that control. So you are giving up certain aspects of control. You can find yourself locked in or held to contractual obligations once you make them. That's not always the case. There's different pricing models, and we'll go into some of those further down the line. But it's something to be wary about. Once you spend money with an IT company, you're going to want to get a return on that investment, and that comes with an obligation to see certain things through. If you go to a third-party IT company, you're also losing some physical presence. There's something to be said about having an IT guy on staff to respond to things. And we'll talk more about some of your needs and what they are and how to address those and communicate them with a third-party provider. But you're going to give up some of that. And it can be expensive. So I know I said earlier it can reduce your operational costs, but it's important to note that it can actually go the opposite way sometimes too. Depending on pricing models and what kind of services you require, a third-party provider can be even more expensive. And so again, we're going to get into some of this later, but it's important to note, and that's why there's the asterisk. Cost is something you're going to have to weigh pretty substantially. So I like to start typically before we get too deep into the presentation and give some resources out. And these are going to be available online. And again, you can contact me at any point in time if you have questions. But obviously, the U.S. Small Business Administration is a tremendous resource for cybersecurity and for IT guidance in general. They have a program underneath them that is specifically designed to help small businesses begin to invest in their IT infrastructure and begin to work and evaluate themselves. CISA, or the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is funded by the Department of Homeland Security, their website is just a treasure trove of free knowledge and tools, recommended tools, research and presentations on how to begin to address some of your security needs in particular. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has a cybersecurity for small business program on their website. Again, it's another free resource. So these are available to you for no cost, and it's worth taking a look at some of them. In the very least, I want to point out something. Small businesses tend to believe that because their footprint in the greater economy might be smaller than some companies, that somehow they're not a target. I can't stress this enough. It's the exact opposite. Larger companies are seeing less and less and less intrusion and attempts on their systems, less and less and less social engineering attempts in comparison per person to small businesses. The analogy I like to use is if you're going to break into a home, the one with the large privacy fence, the 2 Dobermans, and the ADT sign on the front of it is probably not your initial target. The smaller house that no one looks home and they don't have a fence and there's no security in place, that's typically going to be an easier score. So you're going to go that way. These digital criminals tend to look at it the same way. So today we're going to talk about 3 sections of things, and admittedly, the bulk of our conversation is going to be between the first and second thing. And those are your needs. Let's talk about how to evaluate your own company and your IT needs correctly. How you actually evaluate the provider against those needs. And then the last piece is going to be your price. How do you determine what cost model you want to follow and which ones are out there and potentially available to you? So when we talk about your needs, there's 4 sections of needs, and I'm going to highlight these again, but really availability is probably the biggest one. So the first thing to set with what your anticipated availability for IT support is going to be, what are your expectations? And you start by asking yourself a few of these simple questions. How many users do you have? How many users are actually on your IT system? And we'll talk more about evaluating your own IT system, whatever that may be. But how many users are actually digitally involved in the company? How many job sites are you concurrently running on? How many office sites do you have? This helps us talk about something we'll talk about more, which is your scope. And then be honest for yourself. How frequently do you require IT help? Are things breaking all the time? Do you have a lot of user education issues that need to happen that require more touch? This is going to determine a lot of what your service level is when you start to get into third parties. And if you don't need much, then yeah, obviously that can be a good thing for pricing, but it's important to note if you don't need much, that might mean you're not really prepared to respond to certain things when you do need them. So keep that in mind as well. How complicated is your environment? Are you using just a few basic tools like Microsoft Office to run the chunk of your digital business? Or do you have specialized applications? Do you have specialized applications and tools such as automatic weighing machines or inventory control, job tracking software? How complicated is your IT footprint? And answer not just how complicated it is right now, but where would you like to see yourself go? Because one thing I will mention is that the IT company that you begin to work with, if you decide to work with, might be really good at handling you right now and servicing you right now. But maybe if you forecast it out, at some point you're going to have to change if you get a certain size or you have certain changes in your business. Do you have experienced on-site IT help? Do you have someone in your company right now that provides a lot of IT support for you, either because it's a secondary part of their job or just a skill set they have, or someone you've hired? That will determine a lot about what your needs from a third-party provider are. And how do you prefer to be reached? It sounds like a really obvious question, but it's actually really important because the biggest thing I can tell you with working with a third-party company is you're going to want to have strong communication, and you're going to want them to meet you where you like to be met. And that's an important conversation to have. Would you rather they pick up the phone? Would you rather that they come in periodically for meetings and come on site? Would you rather that it's all done over email? Do you want to do text messages even? Like, these things are important to ask, because you're gonna want to make these asks of the company as much as you can. And then, what IT related projects do you have to do or plan on being able to do? So for instance, if you can forecast out, you know that in 6 months, you're going to install a job management software and you have 18 users or 5 users that are going to be, in theory, operating the software. That's something you want to keep in mind and understand about yourself when you go to have that initial conversation. So I mentioned there's really 4 key areas of need, and I wanted to talk about looking at yourself and beginning to ask these questions first. But really what we're trying to hone in is 4 key areas. How available you need that third-party company to be, whether or not they need to be able to support remotely certain solutions, the scope and scale of your company, how big are you, and what do you cover, and what does your IT provider need to be able to service? And then do you have any compliance pieces attached, and how secure do you want your company to be? And I know the obvious question, how secure you want your company to be, is all the security. But what I actually mean by that is, do you have specific requirements or specific goals or specific pieces of information, such as customer lists, pricing sheets, contracts themselves, specific specifications for a contract that you either need to keep safe and keep a hold of, or that you would prefer to, even if it's not by a regulatory means? So when we talk about clearly defining your needs, there are a couple things I really think we need to hone in on. One is, how are you going to communicate to your potential third-party provider an issue? Are you submitting tickets? Are you picking up the phone and just calling them? And then on top of that, are you able to reach out? How do they provide to you communication about what existing issues you have or which past issues you've had? Some companies don't have anything in place for you to be able to just review, what issues you've resolved in the past, how long it took, who helped resolve it. And that can make it difficult going forward to look at trending and stuff like that, and making sure you have good communication there is important. Meetings and reviews. How frequently do you want to go over existing projects or your existing contract and service level? Who needs to be present at these and what will be discussed? So you want to have these conversations with this third party. You want to set a framework in mind for how your relationship is going to be. Because really what we're talking about here when we talk about engaging a third party is, I don't think it's very helpful to think about it as, I'm buying a service and they're going to handle everything. What you're actually doing is entering into a relationship with a company that's going to have very important oversight and access into aspects of your company, sometimes all of your company, and being able to set the parameters for what you think that relationship should look like, both in terms of how you're communicating, who's a part of those communications, and how frequently you're having them, is going to be a tremendous value to you and helps build efficiency and return in that investment in this partnership. And then incident response, and I can't stress this enough. I give many, many talks specifically on incident response in business. In the event that something very bad happens, whether it's an outage of some kind or a cyber attack of some kind, what is the playbook and what are your expectations around that playbook? So for instance, some companies, if you have a cyber incident, you get a full aggressive response from them. They will deploy people on site. They will call you every 30 minutes to an hour to provide you updates, if there are any, on getting you back online. They will give you report outs. They will give you presentations I've seen so many different ways of incident response being very aggressive, and sometimes that comes with a higher cost, but I'm just saying that's part of the scale and scope you can run into. And then I've seen companies that actually have nothing in place to respond. So you can pick up the phone and say, hey, we have ransomware. I can't access literally any of my computers right now. And their response is, we can send a technician in 4 hours. And then it's, okay, so what are we doing in the meantime? How are you supporting us? You know, all of that doesn't happen as aggressively, and that can be really disconcerting. So this is a critical piece, I think, to communicate openly with the company. Now, from the company's perspective, and by the company, I mean the third-party IT company's perspective, there's going to be levels of service they probably are going to offer. So they might have the super deluxe package or the basic package, but have these conversations, because regardless of your business decision about which level of service to enter into with them, you want a clear idea of where the responsibilities are in the event something bad happens. And then also, let's say you go for the basic entry level package or whatever they end up calling it. If you enter into that and then something bad happens and these services you would really like in the event something happens aren't covered, what is your process to quickly engage with another level of service and get that taken care of? And what's the cost, and how do you know how much cost you're taking on? These are questions you're going to want to communicate right away as much as you can early when you're evaluating an IT provider. So we talked a little bit about scope and scale so far, and we're going to go a little deeper into that, because one of the things I will say is that I think sometimes business owners don't quite understand how big their digital footprint tends to be. How many mobile device users do you have? So for instance, if you have a lot of salespeople, or even people who you don't think typically access a digital chunk of your company, are they receiving emails on personal devices? What do those emails carry with them? Do they have access to a SharePoint or a Dropbox or a Google Drive that contains job plans and job information? And if so, that's part of your footprint. So the number of users, think not just also about employees within the company, think about how are you sharing with people, purchasers or people who have entered into contracts with you. Do they have any kind of access to your network, whether it's through shared drives or what have you? Take a time to list out your applications or software that you frequently use. This is a part of your scope of things you need to be covered and managed and protected. Cloud services, if you use any, they're obviously on the rise. They offer typically a lot of flexibility, especially with distributed workforces, for shared systems and tooling, and they can take a lot of the management piece out of your hand. Well, you're going to want to make sure those are supported if you enter into a third-party agreement with a third-party provider. And then shared storage. And what I mean by that is network storage. Do you carry a lot of data on your company? Either, hopefully not just a computer somewhere on the network, but do you have servers, file servers that manage jobs or hold records for you? These are things that are going to need to be protected and obviously are in your environment. And if you have an office, for instance, and servers and all of this, and some companies don't, or they will, but they don't yet. Think about also switches, firewalls, web access points, Wi-Fi access points, those things, wireless access points, those things too. Now, if you have distributed workers, for instance, you have sales guys who are out in the field to talk to companies and win you bids and contracts, and they're away from home, do they go in through remoting into your system if you have one? Or are they using VPN clients? Do they use VPN clients that one of your customers provides? Things like that. Do you have any remote monitoring? Anything to manage these computers on the network? to help you track what they're doing and how they're being used? And do you have any automated processes? And this one is a one that people miss pretty often. I keep bringing up the example of the digital scale, the weigher. I have many companies I've worked with, one in particular that handles minerals as a part of a construction, certain kind of minerals. And those are weighed in bulk, and that scale actually has an automatic service that feeds that inventory information into a database. And they actually did not scope that in with their third-party provider originally. And that's obviously a very important part of their business, but because it was kind of its own little animal, they kind of forgot about it. So don't forget about that. Think about what you have in place totally, and make sure you draw some circles around it in your mind. And then if you don't have any things like that in place, but one day you would like to get to the point that you did, again, keep that in mind too. So one of the pieces I talked about was the compliance piece, and that won't necessarily apply to everybody, but it's something to be very aware of. For instance, if you do federal contracts, there are requirements through the OFCCP through their technical assistance guide of how long you need to retain certain records. And these compliance pieces, whether they're cybersecurity, quote unquote, regulations, or just general Department of Labor regulations or what have you, if they exist and you fall under them with a contract, or if they're even contractual requirements by the person who's entering business with you on this contract, your third-party provider probably needs to know them, because they're going to be configuring, in theory, aspects of your network to do certain things automatically. One of the things with the digital world is we try to automate as many of these processes as possible to make them more efficient. Well, if you have a record retention requirement for, say, 90 days, and your server is saving files every 20 days, then you're out of compliance with that regulation. And that can carry steep penalties. You can be found in breach of contract. There can be very punishing things to do. And you won't have any idea that those digital records aren't being kept as long as they need to, or maintained as frequently as you need them to be, unless you engage your IT provider and make them known some of your requirements. So if you enter any federal contracts with the federal government, you're going to probably need to comply at some point with sections of NIST 800 and 171. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but federal contracts are a good example of contractual requirements that can get flowed down and need to be communicated to an IT provider. So now that we've kind of established a baseline for what your needs are, and we've asked ourselves these questions, and we've taken a list of our users and our applications, and we've had a conversation with ourselves about what kind of level of service we want in the event something goes wrong, and how frequently we feel we need to be managed, we're going to begin to evaluate our IT partner. And when we evaluate our IT partner, there are 4 key instances that I like to help people key into. Number 1 is the location. Where are they located? What's their proximity to your business? What is their willingness and ability to respond on site? And of course, you're going to ask costs for these involved too, but we're going to deal with pricing models a little bit later. And can you visit their office before you enter a contract with them? And this step actually gets skipped all the time. Very frequently, smaller businesses, an IT provider will come and see them, and you'll have your meeting. I recommend the other way around too. Don't be in a rush. You should see where they do work. It's going to sometimes tell you a lot. You're going to want to see where they do business. The next piece is familiarity. Do they have similar clients to you already? Not just in size, but in industry. When we work in certain avenues of the business, certain things tend to keep popping up, right? So those automated scalers and things, those job management softwares. Many companies use either the same one or ones that are very similar. So you're going to want your IT company, ideally, to be used to dealing with companies that function similarly to you. This is going to give them that familiarity and that ability to respond more quickly and with more experience. Are they familiar with your industry? Having them understand, at least at some level, the nature of your business can be tremendously helpful for them and for you to make sure that they're servicing your needs appropriately. That's always one good. And are they capable, and following in that vein, are they capable of watching trends within your industry? Are they aware of certain pieces of software or certain IT processes that are being deployed in either more progressive companies or not being deployed and are being moved away from? If they're tracking these trends, especially if they have clients similar to you, they might be able to help you forecast your future a little bit better. And that might save you money from trying a solution that you either rapidly outgrow or isn't quite as efficient as another option. So now we're talking about scale again, but this time we're talking about the scale of your IT provider. How large is their team? You know, that's not to say a smaller IT company can't provide tremendous service. They can, and they often do. But it's important to understand what that scale is so that you know what to expect. Do they have many clients, which might impact your service response from them? Are they able to dedicate the resources to you that you will need? And how large is their typical client? So for instance, contracting with an IT provider that has a customer base of average company size 450 employees, when you have 25 employees, that not necessarily is a bad fit, but maybe it is. And maybe you're better suited for a company that's more used to handling smaller companies. And then with that is, do you have a designated point of contact? Something I strongly recommend is that the answer to this question is always yes. And it shouldn't be two people. It shouldn't be, oh, someone will always pay attention to you. It should be, this is our person, because they're going to learn your business. They're going to learn the pattern of your needs. They're going to learn your communication style. And that's all going to be very helpful and efficient in this relationship. Because remember, when you contract a third-party IT companies, especially if they handle large or very present aspects of your IT, they're going to be essentially partners with you in this critical piece of your business. You know, you're giving them money to safeguard and to watch over your business. So you're going to want to have a strong communication and a strong rapport with them. And then references, ask for them. Please ask for references. So many people actually skip this step. Do not be afraid to ask for references and then speak to those references. You know, you're going to want to hear from customers, I promise you, about what to expect. And maybe they'll give you some insight about how to better get value out of this relationship. And again, I keep saying relationship because while you are purchasing a service, and in theory, when you purchase a service, you are just entitled to certain things, and you are, it's important to note that like any service relationship, there is a lot of that communication piece that goes into it. And with IT in particular, where they have kind of the keys to the kingdom, you want to feel good about trusting that relationship and working together. And you want to feel like they're invested. So ask for these things, look for these things, and don't be afraid of especially in that initial conversation, making sure that you get good answers to these. Now, there's a couple additional questions too that I don't want to step away from, but they're a little bit more general and but still very, very valuable. Do they outsource aspects of their IT? So do they, as a third-party provider, outsource services or tools? You're going to want to know that. Is there a chance that in in an instance where you have a certain kind of trouble or help or ticket or project, are you going to be dealing with a subcontractor, essentially? Now, in most cases, this can just become a convenience problem or maybe a change in process slightly. In worst cases, depending on your contractual requirements, this might actually pull you out of compliance or put you in trouble in regards to an information protection standard. So we won't talk too much about the compliance piece. It's just something to be aware of if you handle those kinds of contracts. But if not, in the very least, you would kind of like to know that you're going to be dealing with a third party to the third party, as it were. Do they have accreditations? This is a good question to ask, particularly if they're handling large amounts of your data or storing it. Are they certified for SOC or ISO 27001? Have they gone through a cloud service, a CSA or Cloud Services Alliance audit? You know, these kind of things. If you're working with the DoD with some of these contracts, have they gone through a NIST 800-171 piece? So these are all things that are very much you would like to ask. Now, again, that's not saying people without accreditations cannot provide great service to you. It's just a question I would ask so you have a clear picture of where you're at. And then finally, and obviously, is how long have you been in business? That's not to say startups can't be aggressive and provide tremendous service, but there's something to be said for experience too. And so deciding what you're comfortable, maybe you want the young, hungry, fresh face into the game and to be one of those building block clients for them. I totally understand that. And I think I've seen that work out very well for a bunch of companies, but maybe you need something a little bit more experience and it makes you feel better to know. Either or, get the answer to that question and decide for yourself which way you want to go there. So now we're going to get to the last real section of this, which is when you choose a third-party provider, what are some of the pricing models you can anticipate and how do you price this? And this will kind of round out my introduction to this. So there are 6 typical managed services pricing models. And the first one is monitoring only. And this tends to be they put a tool on your system of sorts, and it monitors general things like antivirus and patching and some basic logging perhaps. Or they just have a monitoring tool on your boundary firewall or whatever level you go to, and all it does is provide monitoring and alerting. They're not providing actual IT services support. They're not providing disaster recovery or incident response. They're not managing your storage or your backups or any of that. All of these needs, these pieces that you might have, that's not what they're there to do. They're just kind of watching the network, and if something really bad happens, they're saying, hey, we got an alert. There's a per user model. For very small companies, you tend to run into this, where they price their platform out per user. So if you have 5 users, you have 5 licensing agreements or whatever they call them, typically licensing agreements, and you pay per person. And that tends to be monthly, but it can be annually depending. That's one of the models. And there's benefits to that sometimes, except with any flat fee, again, you can tend to become contractually bound. And so maybe you could have saved money using one of the other models. It all depends. There's an all you can eat. You know, this is you pay a flat monthly fee and then everything we can offer is included. And that can be obviously one of the more expensive options, but more responsive. There is a per device. Instead of per user, there's a per device. So you're covering individual computers or pieces of equipment. So these models we're talking about fall under 2 real categories, right? We have the per per coverage, the a la carte version, where you're paying for this user and not that one, or those users and not that one, or that computer. And then we have the flat rate umbrella version, the service levels involved. And then the next one we like to look at is the tiered. Tiered services are, like I said before, where maybe they have an entry-level service, and then you can upgrade to a secondary tier when you need, or sometimes you have to do it out of the gate, depending on certain factors. But this would be like, maybe they have storage they can provide for you, like digital storage for certain amounts of data. And if you go over, there's a penalty, but otherwise we used to see this with cell phones a lot, less now, thankfully, but service providers can offer that with data services, for instance. So you have 2 terabytes of cloud service storage available. And, if you go up to 4 terabytes, it's another price, and then 10 terabytes or however many, you can see that. And then there's the obvious a la carte one, which is its individual services. So when I talk about all this, what are we really looking at? We're looking at a service level agreement, something you will sign that will detail the level of service that you are entitled to from them. And you get to define what that looks like. It can be a per month or per year basis. It can be for month to month, or job to job, or annual for 2 years, say, a service level contract. That's actually pretty common for most companies, a 2-year service agreement. Then you can see a la carte, which the most common right now version of this is actually block hours, where you will purchase 25 block hours of IT support. Maybe you, or a combination of these. So maybe you get general monitoring, AV, antivirus, patching, things like that for aspects of your system. And they handle that in general. And then in the event that there's an incident, you have purchased 25 block hours. And when you ask for their help, say someone's email isn't working correctly and they need help getting it fixed, they would call this IT company, and this IT company would provide help, and the block hours would be used slowly or quickly, depending. And then when they're done, you either need to refresh or go without. So that's a very common model right now. And the other thing with block hours is it can also be used for individual projects. And this is typically how MSPs price themselves against your average project. You will have a project meeting. They will scale or scope out how many hours they think it's going to take them, as well as what tools they'd use if you're paying for those. And they'll say, okay, so we think this project will take 30 hours. Say we're installing 4 new servers. To get those 4 new servers, we think it's going to take 30 man hours to install them and get them running. And then you're going to purchase against that hour assessment. And so those are really the pricing models. And so I think it stands to reason that some of these work for some companies and some of them don't. And which one you are, you're going to have a better idea of once you begin to scale and scope your company and assess your own needs adequately. And then from that, you can actually, from that, you can actually make decisions and questions about how you're going to evaluate your provider, and then finally price them. So that's generally how I would recommend doing this. If you do have resources available to you to assist you in this, like the ones I mentioned above, or you want to contact MEPs are great. The MEPs there's the Wisconsin MEP. I know their group there very well. They can provide some guidance. And then we're available for certain portions of that. Go ahead and email me. I'm going to put my contact information here in the future. So do we have any questions for this at all? Okay, well, Thank you for having me. I hope this was informative. I know this is going to be available online, but it was a pleasure to speak to you all today.